We're living in unprecedented times. Our routines and schedules, our reality has changed, and it seems like it's changed overnight. We miss our family, our friends, our coworkers as we quarantine. We miss our Sunday mornings worshiping in church, and we miss those that we have loved and lost to COVID-19. All this change and loss, it can create swirling emotions and questions for us. I'm Reverend Deborah Pierce from Ponds Reformed Church in Oakland, New Jersey. The Reverend Jim Knoll, minister of Word and Sacrament in the Reformed Church in America, a licensed clinical social worker, and former director of Pastoral Care Department at the Christian Healthcare Center in Wyckoff, New Jersey, has graciously sat down with me via Zoom and had a conversation about these emotions and questions. So without further ado, here is Emotion, Faith, and Quarantine, a COVID-19 conversation.
For doing this, because I have, from so many different angles, not just congregational, but so many people have been sharing their struggles in this time. And so I thought just getting together, talking a little bit with you, because you are both an LCSW, a licensed clinical social worker, and an ordained minister of Word and Sacrament in the Reformed Church in America. I know, retired now, congrats, right? But so you have a lot to offer, and I just think that putting these out there will help people understand they're not alone in what they're feeling, because this is certainly a time none of us have ever could have imagined, and so there's just a lot of emotion swirling. So thank you for your time to do this, and for the folks out there who will get to see this and listen to this, I offer lots of peace and love and connectedness through this.
Thanks for asking. And as a pastor on the front lines, as an essential worker in my mind, thank you for just being listening and talking and helping those folks that are in need. I continue to facilitate a couple of clergy groups, and so I'm hearing the stories. I'm hearing the stories of what it means to be doing church right now, and how difficult and challenging that is, and how everything is changing for you all. So thanks for doing what you do and being who you are.
Oh, well, thank you. It's a teamwork effort, absolutely, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm going to jump right in and say probably the first thing that comes to mind is we now have people who are in close quarters, families who are not used to spending so much time together. We've got introverts and extroverts. How, when one is driving the other nuts, what's a good way to understand the other person and handle the situation?
That is what I'm hearing. I mean, not so much from clergy as much as I'm hearing it from other media sources, yep, including my own family. My daughter is a teacher, so she's at home in her apartment with her two kids, 10-year-old and a 14-year-old, who are trying desperately to do school online, and it's challenging for them. And my daughter tends to be a little bit more of an introvert, so she's kind of saying, I'm okay in this time, I'm doing fine, and I'm okay. And when she happened to see that quote that right now for an introvert this is a dream, and for an extrovert it's a nightmare, she started laughing. And my 10-year-old granddaughter, who is not an introvert by any stretch of the imagination, looked at her and got angry and said, "Why are you laughing at that?" And Claire said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I need people." And that is probably part of the problem. That some of us just need that physical contact more than others. So how do you deal with that in the confines of a house where you're all together? For some of us that are blessed with more space, that provides us the space to do that. But for some of us who don't have that space, it really challenges our need to be honest with each other in terms of what do we need, and in terms of parents for kids to be asking the kids, what do they need right now? Do you need some time alone? Or do you need some time on, doing some of the social media stuff, connecting with your friends? What do you need right now? What's best for you? And I think it's challenging for parents to try to be creative day after day after day, to try to find out ways to meet those needs of those kids. For those of us that are older who can be more in touch with our feelings and more in touch with our needs, hopefully we can be honest with each other. But then the second step is to be able to acknowledge that by the other person and to respect that by the other person. Living together is always an issue of negotiating needs, in terms of how do you meet each other's needs, but how do you respect each other? So that whole thing about two shall become one is always an issue. And I remember that every wedding that I would do, I would ask the couple if they we're going to do a unity candle, of course. Do we still do unity candles?
Some do.
Do we? Okay.
Or stand.
I would always ask, when you're doing a unity candle, do you blow out the other candles and just light the center one? And they would say, of course, well, we never thought about that. And I said, well, think about the symbolism of that. What does that mean? And I would let them struggle with that a little bit. But I think the symbolism there is that those two candles are still individual candles, but there's another entity that's created, which is that coupleness, however you want to call that. And that's where the negotiating comes in mind, where you have to respect the individuality, but then there's this other thing that you have to work into and be creative about and acknowledge and respect as well. So, it's tough. It's just tough. But I think the more we can grow into being honest with each other. We had a story that I heard from a neighbor where their daughter was going to come to visit upon invitation and stay at a distance. And when she arrived at the driveway, they could see that she was very, very uncomfortable getting out of the car. And it turned out later that she didn't even want to go. She did not want to go and be out of the car and be even at a distance with this family, our neighbors. And so the encouragement was, well, could she have said that? Could she have said, honestly, I don't even want to be there. And the neighbors said, we would have accepted that. We would have heard that, and we would have acknowledged that and said, it's okay, we understand. But she feared that. And so she lived into her fear rather than living into her honesty. And she ended up being very, very uncomfortable. And it didn't help the relationship at that point either. They had to talk about it then.
Right. No, absolutely. Interesting that you bring up fear. I've had several people come to me with struggles with fear and faith at this time.
Right.
They read in the Bible and in devotionals, your faith should be strong enough that you don't have any fear, and so there is that struggle. Do I not have enough faith then? And so how would you answer someone like that? I know how I've answered them, but how would you answer that from both the minister point of view, but also knowing the psychological point of view, being a social worker, like LCSW? And
if the roles were reversed right now, I would be saying to you, so how do you answer that?
I know, exactly, right?
I've always been struck with, and especially since it's Easter season, when Jesus appears in that upper room and says, fear not, it's not a command. It's never a command by Jesus to fear not, or even do not be anxious. It's an invitation. It's if to say, I understand what you're going through. You don't have to be fearful right now. There are other ways to live. So I don't see fear as being the opposite of faith at all. In fact, I looked that up when I saw what one of your questions might be, and Anne Lamott says that the opposite of faith is confidence. So that, when you become so confident that you're sure of yourself and you're sure of the world around you and you know what's happening, then there's no room for faith relationship in that. There's no room for God. You've got it all. So I think to live in faith is to live into uncertainty. So, when we talk about that, we look at the Bible and it says, don't be afraid, don't be anxious, and all those things. I see that more as invitational, which means that I can then begin to explore within myself. Okay,
Mhm.
what am I going to do with those feelings
Mhm.
of uncertainty, fear, and anxiety, and all that? And one of the slogans that I picked up for myself a few years back was that I was going to decide that I didn't want to just learn how to accept uncertainty, but I wanted to learn how to embrace uncertainty.
Mhm.
And so I chose to do a pilgrimage walk in Spain, as you know. And the whole time that I was doing that, I was trying to live into the uncertainty of what's next and trying to embrace that and say, I will find God in the uncertainty rather than in the sureness of that. If I was making reservations for every night where I was going to stay, there's no uncertainty in that, and of course then it would be less opportunity to be amazed at what was coming. So I think that that's part of my answer to say, what do you do with that? I think that it's not about fear being the opposite of faith. I think we can live in faith with fear. It's what we do with it. Fear is a feeling. It's what we do with those feelings that determine whether we're faithing or not faithing our lives. And I think, certainly we're created in the image of God, so we're created with the capacity to have feelings. Therefore, fear is not bad. Fear is not wrong. It's a natural result of living in a broken world. So the question then is, what are you going to do with that? How are you going to live then with those feelings and those uncertainties?
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
like you're
Yeah, actually, it's similar. It is.
excellent.
Although I didn't go with the whole confidence being the opposite, and I like that. I'm going to use that definitely.
I think it's wonderful. I
It-
agree.
because it makes a lot of sense. It's true. What I have said is God created us. God knows we have these emotions. They're not bad. But
Yeah.
you're right. It's what we do with them. Do we let the fear rule, or do we grab onto the faith? And we just need that tiny little bit, and God's with us.
Well,
So
and I think, thank you. And I think that that's part of it, is that when we live into faith, we're living into curiosity.
mhm,
If certainty is the opposite of faith, then faith means to live with some curiosity, sense of wonder, sense of amazement, sense of openness.
yeah,
And in our Western civilization, we tend not to do that well. We don't like uncertainty. We like things to be solved. We like things to be solved quickly. We have fast food lines. We have fast answer lines. We have 10 things to do quickly to solve this problem lines. We have all of that sort of stuff that says this is what you need to do to take care of that ugly thing called uncertainty and unknowingness. It's unsettling. Um, when I look at Scripture, I don't see Scripture ever calling us to settled. It calls us to be unsettled. It's the Israelites walk through the wilderness where they are to find God, not in the settledness of the routine of Egypt. Even when they want to go back there, they knew the rules. They were horrible rules, but they knew what to expect. And God is saying, yeah, you're going to find me in the wilderness where you don't know what to expect, because that's when you'll find me more. Your eyes will be more open that way. So all of this right now, I think, is really challenging. If there's a crisis of faith, it's a crisis to say we're being called to check our unsettledness that's very deep within us, our insecurity. We are, all of us are insecure to some degree, and this is challenging our insecure person to say, what are you going to do with that? Can you live into the insecure world rather than trying to deal with the myth of I can solve everything, I can do everything, I can be everything, I can take care of this, I can fix it.
right,
We can't.
right,
We
right.
can't. We have to work together at fixing this as a community. None of us can do it on our own.
No, absolutely. Community, I think, is the biggest piece of this all, however we're able to grab it, for sure. But you just said how our society very much wants us to be able to fix it and solve it and do that immediately. And so one of the quotes I've heard has been, use this time to learn a new skill, or, try something different, or you should be a different person, a better person by the time this is over, if you use your time wisely. And yet I hear so many people say, I can't do anything. I'm struggling. I come home. I I get off my computer from work, if they're even fortunate enough to still have their job,
Right.
and they feel like they cannot do anything, like there's no energy. How would you speak to that?
Yeah, somebody once said, there's a reason why we're human beings and not human doings. Our usual solution to fix things and to make us feel better about ourselves or others is doing. I don't see it that way. So when we talk about I should come out of this, first of all, I have a problem with the should word, but I should come out of this as a stronger person.
Mhm.
I think there are opportunities to come out of this as a stronger person. It may be about learning a new skill. It may be about learning a new language. It may be learning a new craft. It may be learning how to cope differently with whatever. But for me, coming out stronger means being stronger. It means, coming out of this with a renewed sense of who I am and who we are together. That maybe I'll be able to see things differently than I had seen them before. How can I be a better person means not being able to have more skills. It means having a better spirit, stronger spirit. So, yeah, I think it's not an either or. I think the doing and the being go hand in hand, and I usually see the doing growing out of the being. So, in other words, as I grow stronger within myself, I find more opportunities to do. As my faith grows stronger, and as my faith becomes something where I see God in more places, or see God in the eyes of others in a better way, I find myself then looking for ways to volunteer, or I look for ways to kind of make masks for people or whatever. So as Reformed people, Debbie, and we remember this from our ordination exams, I think, where does our acts of gratitude come out of? Our acts of gratitude grow out of the sense of what God has already done for us. We don't try to act into God's pleasure. We react as a response to God's blessing.
Mhm.
So it all fits for me. It really does. It all fits for me that our doing then grows out of our sense of being renewed internally. And the Apostle Paul, when the Apostle talks about the fact that daily we're declining, we're regressing, we're disappearing as we get older and older, but internally we're being renewed every day. That's hard to do right now, but I think that's one of the opportunities that's there for us, is to do the internal work. I think if the myth is true, that we do things in order to make ourselves feel successful, then I think what we find ourselves is we need to do the work of internal growth. Let's focus on that work rather than pretending that if I make myself busy, I'll be okay.
Right.
A little subtle difference. Busyness comes out of being okay, not to become okay. If that makes sense.
It does. It does.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's a good answer. I think we're so conditioned by our society to be busy, to have such full schedules, that some of us are really just learning how to be
Yeah,
in this. And I think that's an incredible accomplishment.
it is, but it's very uncomfortable for some of us to do that.
It is. Absolutely.
I think for those people that are used to silence and used to quiet, and again, the introvert has the advantage there. They're okay with a quiet household,
Mhm.
but the person who needs to fill that space and needs to have a lot going on, the frenetic stuff happening all the time because it's stimulus, and the stimulus is something that feeds them. It's a challenge to be quiet. It's a challenge to find meditation time and quiet time,
It
but
is.
it's an important piece.
It is. I agree. Absolutely. Um, Speaking of personalities, I've also heard people say my emotions are just all over the place. I don't really know even who I am right now.
Right.
You know, I can be really in a great space at one moment, and the next, like the flip of a switch, I'm in close to tears. And where do you think that comes from in all this?
Um, One of the things that I would be
Hmm.
asking people is, have you ever felt this way before?
Hmm.
And and usually for those people who have experienced profound grief, they will
Hmm.
say yes,
Hmm.
because this experience is a lot like profound grief. Grief is one of those things that is a mess of emotions that are just all being entangled together, and very difficult to isolate them and say this is this feeling, this is this feeling. It's usually just all over the place, and it's exhausting to try to feel or to try to deal with those kind of feelings. Um, if that is true, then I find myself asking the follow-up question: what might we be grieving?
Hmm.
You know, if this is grief like, then what might we be grieving? What have we lost? And when we can start to look at that a little bit, we begin to see we lost some pretty significant things. Beside losing friends, beside losing colleagues, we've lost ordinariness. You know, we've lost routine. We've lost all the things that provided us a sense of security, and all those things that provided us a sense of comfort in what's expected and knowing how things work. We don't know that anymore, and so we're grieving. I think that sense of the things aren't the way they were before. How many times have we heard people say, "I can't wait for things to get back to the way they were"?
Right.
The check is that things never do.
Right.
You know, look at the story of Scripture. Things never go back to the way they were. They're all, even whenever God provides a remnant to start a new thing, it's always a new thing. It's not an old thing going back.
Right. Right.
So, so, you know, God is always in the work of creating something new, and that means we're always dealing with grief.
Right.
Always. We're always grieving that which was, and a lot of times that's why we say, why can't things just go back the way they were? Well, I'm
Mm.
sorry. They can't, nor should they.
Yeah.
And me as an individual, I shouldn't either. This is going to change me. I can't go back to the way I was.
Right.
It's an impossibility, because all these events have changed me. The fear of whether I'm going to get sick, the anxiety of not knowing what today's going to bring, the exhaustion of how am I going to deal with kids. All of that changes us, and it changes us in permanent ways, hopefully for the better.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
so I think your initial question was, am I so exhausted with all this? Uh, the other, one of the things to remember about feelings,
Right.
feelings are, the way I see it, feelings are energy. Okay, that uh, our body system, our biopsychosocial system, we like to be in a constant. We like it to be in what's called a homeostatic state. Any kind of change to that homeostatic state, that constant, changes is because of feelings. Feelings come in to tell us something. Something needs to change in that constant, in that way that things have always been. So when we experience fear, when we experience anger, when we experience love, when we experience any of those things, it's calling on the system to change in some way. That's energy. So if you're dealing with all sorts of feelings going on at the same time, that's the system is being called upon to change in huge ways. It's like taking the rubber band and just doing this the whole time.
Oh,
And,
that's imagery.
and
Wow.
yeah, you may not see anything on the outside, but it's all going on inside. It's in our spirit, it's in our soul, it's in our heart, and when you talk to people, they'll start talking about physical manifestations of that stress, because that's what's being stressed, is that the system is being stressed to change. So no wonder we're exhausted. You know, we may be doing nothing on the outside, or we may be very busy on the computer, or all of those things, and we say, but I'm exhausted. Yeah, you're exhausted because this is a huge stress on our psychosociological system. And we're being called upon to come up with ways to deal with that we haven't been called upon before. So it's all new. The brain is a highly adaptive organ, and the brain is always looking for patterns, so that when there's some stimulus, like that door that's behind you, if that door were to open, your brain would perceive that as stimulus. Your brain would very quickly internally say, what's going on? Who is that? Has that happened to me before, where somebody opened a door behind me and I didn't know what it was? The result may be a feeling of fear, curiosity, any number of feelings that come up, and that's going to determine your body reaction to that. You're going to jump,
Right.
or you're going to turn around and look. All of that is patterned. Your brain is finding the files back here that say, where have I gone through this before? And I'm going to click into that. And that's where we have patterned responses that are sometimes adaptive and sometimes maladaptive, and they're not good at all.
Right.
So the trick to that is to recognize that the brain is trying to find patterns of where have I been like this before. And when we're dealing with all those feelings being mangled up together, for people who have experienced grief, they can go back there and they can say, oh yeah, that's what this is like. And I got through that. It took time. Maybe there was some even traumatic stuff that happened over time, but I did get through it. And for people who haven't been there before, you kind of say, okay, you haven't experienced this before, the intensity of this before, but others have. And there is a way that we will get through this. There is a beginning, there is a middle, there is an end. We may not know where we are in that journey, but it is a journey.
That kind of it fits for me why people have been saying I'm like, I can't stop eating, I feel like I'm drinking more, I feel like I'm smoking more, doing something habitual more. That kind of makes sense to me. If we're constantly in this stimulus, we need something that is kind of that pattern that we know then, while our minds are searching out another pattern.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. We, what the kind of foods that are going quickly off the shelf is Kraft macaroni and cheese.
Yeah, right? You can't find it on the shelf.
We're going back to being 6 years old again. And how did I find comfort then? Oh, Mom made me Kraft macaroni and cheese, and how wonderful was that? So, we have these ways back there that we learned, this is comforting for me. What is it? And some of that is good. Some of that's not so good. Like if we revert back to behaviors that we thought bring us comfort and they become addictive, not so hot. Others can be very adaptive. Meditation, listening to some music that provides you a sense of comfort. What are the things that are comforting and feed your soul at the same time? Because that's where I think we can explore some of the more positive ways to do that. That it doesn't detract from your soul, but it feeds your soul. If it becomes addictive in a bad way, so whether that's by eating, smoking, or drinking, whatever like that, we have to start disciplining ourselves to kind of take a break from that. How do we begin to reduce that? And it's a lot like taking a fast during Lent.
Okay.
You begin to say, okay, I'm going to create space by not doing something for a while in order for something else to fill up that space. So can I cut back a cigarette a day? Can I cut back a drink a day? How do I discipline myself so that space can be filled by something else? Because that kind of comfort is not good comfort all the time.
Right. No, absolutely. I think I'd also just recommend to anybody, if you're looking for ideas on meditative readings, maybe, or something along those lines to help create that space, or to connect, to help connect better with God. Talk to your pastor or a pastor.
Yeah, absolutely. Those pastors are loving those phone calls. I mean, when you call the pastor and say, hey, let's talk a little bit. I'm really having trouble with this online worship stuff, and talk to me about that. They would love to do that. A lot of them are trying to figure, well, they're all trying to figure this out too, and how do we do church? And early on, I had a couple of pastors say to me and said, this whole thing has thrown me for a loop. I'm used to going to nursing homes. I'm used to going to hospitals. I'm used to going to funeral homes. And they said, I can't do that. How do I fill that time? And the fear that congregants are going to see them as not filling that time and wasting time. And instead, what I see is that this is incredibly challenging for them, and that's not a lot of wasting time going on. They're filling a lot of creative juices, whether that's easy for them or not, to say, how do I do this? I personally think that church is going to be changed, maybe dramatically by this. I think that this is giving us all sorts of opportunities to check on how we do church. And maybe finding some creative ways to do church that we haven't done before. I personally think that, and I don't know if you've noticed, I don't know if you and Nathan have noticed at Ponds, but the people that are watching on, let's say, I think you guys do YouTube, right?
We do, yes.
So have you been able to monitor the numbers? Have you seen that the numbers are larger than what would you normally see in a worship attendance?
Yeah, I think
Almost
so.
universally true. Almost universally true. This is an interesting thing. That it's anecdotal. I don't know if there's been any research on it, but more people are accessing worship through this kind of means than we're attending in pews.
Right.
Maybe. And if so, what does that mean when things go back to people being able to go to church buildings again?
Right.
Are we still going to offer this for those people who really feel uncomfortable going into church buildings, who maybe want to remain a little bit more anonymous, millennials who are very used to this, or anybody younger? Those of us who are old. Interesting questions, I think.
Absolutely. We have a lot of adventure, I think, ahead of us as
Exactly.
the church.
Good way to put it. I like that.
Right.
And again, are we comfortable? Do we like adventure, or are we afraid of adventure?
Right. Right.
Adventure is change, right?
It is.
Adventure is change.
It is.
So are we going to resist that and avoid that and run away from that? Or are we going to embrace it and say, what will God do with this?
Right. Right. Exactly. For me, I know it's about reframing it. I tend to go negative at first, anything for myself, and the fear tends to take the larger seat. But then I can reframe it and say, hey, but wait a minute, this is an adventure. This is exciting. I do feel that sense of excitement as well. And so for me, I try to grab onto that and look at it that way. And
it's really giving us the opportunity to do it. It really is.
Right.
As hard as it is.
It is.
Yeah.
I'm going to get back to grief for a minute, because I don't think there is anybody out there who hasn't in some way or another been touched by a loss through COVID-19. We have lost some really great colleagues. We've had a couple of members of our congregation. I think anybody, there's no one that's not remained untouched by this. And I've heard it expressed, they were alone when they died. And there is, again, those emotions of anger, of sadness, of guilt, all those emotions swirling around. What would you say to somebody who is expressing that, and in order to give them a little comfort, maybe?
It's hard, because that's one of the things that I think plagues me more, that imagining what that's like. And even for you and I, who have lost some colleagues, and to not be able to officially recognize that, or officially acknowledge that, or go to a memorial service. You know, we need to do those things, and we're robbed of those opportunities. We're robbed of the opportunities of being with loved ones when they're sick. I mean, that's exactly when we tend to really rise up to what it means to love, is when another loved one is in need. So, how do we provide comfort? There's no good way. There's just no satisfactory, that's probably a better word. There's no satisfactory way to feel like I did enough.
Mhm.
in those situations. So if it's not enough, what's acceptable? What can we live with to know we did what we could? Is it enough to pray? Is it enough to call the nurse and have the nurse convey messages to the loved one, or if there is phone? What's enough that you know you've made the attempts that you need to do to connect? Because it's about connection, right? It's all about connection,
Right.
and right now we're not connecting in the ways that we're used to. So how do we do that? How can we feel good about our efforts to do that? Um, the first loss that I became aware of that I'm not sure was COVID-19 was my predecessor at the healthcare center, the person who was the chaplain at the healthcare center before I got there. And when I heard that he had died, there was like a whole chapter in my mind that just ended. Because I knew him and I knew him well, and he paved the way for my work as I paved the way for whoever's next. And it was like this continuity that in my heart had been going on for a total of 50, 60 years or something like that, ended. It just ended, and I had no way to officially grieve that. I recognize that I had not been able to say goodbye to him, and then I wondered, did I acknowledge him? Did I honor him? Did I thank him in all the ways that I could have? And so all those things go through our mind, like, did I do everything I could have done? And eventually we have to come to the place of being honest with ourselves to say yes or no to that.
Mhm.
And if we say yes, we're in a good place. And if we say no, then we have to deal with some forgiveness. The self-forgiveness to say, okay, how could I have done that differently? How might I have done that differently? And I can do it differently next time, because there will be a next time.
Right.
There will always be a next time. So yeah, I know of, I think nine RCA clergy, maybe 10 now, 10 RCA clergy who have died.
Wow.
So that's not just, and you know of a couple of them that have been very significant denominationally, and yesterday we heard about a third. These are people you kind of wonder, what does that do to a denomination? You know, when you, some of these were retired and some of these might be expected, but what does it do to a denomination to experience that loss? Because in some ways we're a family as well, a small denomination, you know, where we know a lot of people.
Yeah.
It's like dealing with a congregation itself, when you deal with the people that aren't going to be in those pews anymore, that always were.
Right.
You knew when they weren't there because the spot was empty. You know?
Right.
And now the spot's empty in your heart. You know, and how do you deal with that? I think grieving is one of the most powerful processes that we go through. I think we underestimate it. I think we try to escape it and avoid it. I became known at the healthcare center as the grief guy, because I'm the guy that would always be naming it and asking and saying, let's talk about it. It's a powerful, powerful thing. And one of the things that I have stated in my work is that any experience of grief usually reminds us of a previous experience of grief. The details may not be the same, but the grief is similar. And it just resonates and resurrects all of that that difficulty again, which is why so many of us are just so sad right now. Just we're constantly in the midst of that.
Wow.
And that reminds us to think about all the different ways we respond to grief. You know, the Kubler-Ross stuff that's talked about 5 stages, but there's so much more than that in terms of recognizing the power of grief and the length of grief and the customized nature of grief. One of the things that I say to people is that my grief is my grief. My loss is my loss. You may not take it away from me. You may not rob me of the opportunity to deal with the adventure of that grief journey, because I can come through this and be a better person, a stronger person because of that journey. And if you take it away from me, there, don't feel so bad. You're robbing me of what God has given me as a gift. which is the feeling of grief.
Yeah. Wow. I've never heard it put that way. I've certainly heard it expressed, this is my grief. You can't tell me how I should or should not feel, but to look at it as if you would be robbing me of that's powerful.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I need to walk through it, and there's nobody that can walk through it in my shoes. I have to do that.
Right.
Fortunately, I'm in a community of people that can walk alongside me while I do that.
Right.
That's important too.
And I think, yeah, that's a huge piece. I think, again, I always come back to community. It is about our relationships with people, our community, who we do have to walk alongside of in our life, because they that can make or break us, I think.
I think it can, and I do a lot of walking, and I have found it challenging to do that these days, and still respect physical distance. Was it Nathan? I think Nathan was talking about that on Sunday, right?
It was Nathan. Yeah. Good.
So to respect that physical distancing thing, I have noticed that there's a lot more sharing going on the walks when I do encounter people that are 20 feet away from me. Like, hi, and how are you doing? And cute dog. And it's not deep, but it's convivial. And there's more of it than was happening before. And it's not a bad thing. So, I think to recognize how that changes us as well in terms of connecting, even at a distance.
Mm-hmm. I think that actually highlights some of the good that has come out of this time, because, people, again, can be so focused on what we've lost in this. But I think this has also been a time where we've gained as people. And I think just those interactions with people as we're walking with that physical distance, there has been a gain. I've seen people in town step up, who needs me to go shopping? I can go shopping, and I just think that's really fantastic.
And if we're in a bad place mentally and physically and emotionally and spiritually, our eyes may not be open to those things. We may not recognize the power and the miraculous nature of those things, or the godness of those things, but they truly are. One of the things that I've heard about the difficulty in worshiping over electronic means, it makes me think that, or reminds me, I think, that we've gotten into a little bit of a separation. That church is the sacred space, and the rest of our life is secular. And I don't think Scripture has ever designed it to be that kind of dichotomy and separation, where if I want to identify with my sacred, with my spiritual, with my God, I go to church. And now that I can't go to church, I've lost something. Well, maybe this is an opportunity to see the sacred in our lives, to see the sacred in the beauty right now. In terms of, have you noticed that the red buds don't care about coronavirus?
Right.
And the animals, the squirrels, are still hopping around. They don't care about the coronavirus. Nature is still moving on, and in nature we see God. And so this is giving us the opportunity to see things differently, with different eyes, rather than just seeing church as the home of my sacred life. I'm able now to see sacred all around me in new ways and different ways. I think that's a wonderful gift to have that comes out of this tragedy and out of this mess, is that we're able to begin to see, rather than these things as being mutually exclusive, they're really the same thing. Right. I happen to be watching I'm trying to change my language on this. I happen to be with a church in Des Moines on Sunday, and it's a mega church. Somebody had said, "Oh, let's together from a distance watch this, be with them," and he was sitting in a nice, comfortable chair in this nice, comfortable space, and he was talking about the walls closing in. And what was referring to Jericho and the walls coming down, and it was a beautiful, delightful sermon, and but the difficulty of feeling the walls closing in at this time, and all of a sudden he says, but God has a way of breaking down walls, and all of a sudden the room that he was in, the walls just collapsed. And you discovered that he was sitting in this huge parking lot right next to the pond, in front of this mega church parking lot. And he started to say, yep, there are no walls. And he started walking across the parking lot as he's continuing his sermon, as he enters into the building and enters into the worship space. It was wonderful. It was a little hokey, maybe,
But
but it was a wonderful.
imagery. Yeah.
Yeah, the image was powerful. That he was comfortable in that nice little space with those walls.
Right.
But there was so much more. There was so much more for him when he began to look at things differently. I thought it was a great illustration. He could have talked about it and not done the same thing as what he did. I thought it was. I mean, you can only do that when you've got huge tech people around you.
Exactly. But wow, wow,
Yeah,
to be able to do
wow.
that.
Yeah.
Because
Both-
seeing it is so much different than hearing it.
Absolutely. And both Sharon and I just went, whoa, that was
Kind of cool. I noticed our time is we're actually close to an hour almost. About 15 minutes we've been chatting, and I would love to continue this. Clearly, this is stuff that turns my crank. I love talking about this thing.
Me too.
But I do want to recognize, people do have other Zoom meetings and stuff to get on to. Anything else as an LCSW, as a minister? Is there anything else that you want to be sure that people hear, that they're made aware of before we end our time together?
One of the things that disturbs me right now is what I see people reverting back to me thinking versus we thinking. And I see it in some of the rallies where people are saying, I have a right to go to my hairdresser. I have a right to go to the beach. I have a right to do this. You can't tell me that I need to stay home. You can't tell me to wear a mask. You can't tell me I have a right for myself. And when I look at scripture, I don't see that. I don't see the prophets talking about what you have a right to do. And I see the prophets talking about what it means for the community and the fact that you sacrifice for the community. And it hit me, probably about 3 weeks ago or so, when I was thinking about all the people who are sacrificing by working in the nursing home at the Christian Healthcare Center, or by working in the grocery stores or the gas stations, or all those people that historically have been invisible to us,
Right.
and voiceless, and how those are now considered essential. And I'm thankful for that. God bless them. And we talk about them making a sacrifice for the rest of us. And then we turn around out of some sense of disrespect and say, but I'm going to do this for me. And I thought, maybe my staying home is also a small sacrifice in order to kind of keep this thing constrained, or to keep it from spreading a little bit. If that's what I can do, is a small sacrifice for the we, for the us, for the community, then it puts some meaning to it for me. It's not just about me and my rights. And I think that brings me back to what I think has been one of the major problems of the church for 2,000 years, is that when we start focusing on the individual only and forgetting about the individual's faith role in the community, we've lost what Jesus was talking about. We've certainly lost about what Jesus was talking about in terms of changing the world and making the world a better place. It's like, this affects you so that it can affect everyone. And somehow we just get stuck with this affects you. And that's the end of the story. It's not the end of the story. God is doing so much more when we're talking about how the we are working at this together. And all the data is showing that when the we is working together, this thing is more controlled, the curve is lowered, however you want to phrase that. But when the me gets elevated, this thing goes out of control. And if that's a lesson for us in terms of how we live faithfully and how we live biblically and how we live, I mean, those prophets warned us over and over and over again about the me. and about what I want to do is right. My feelings are the only ones that you need to pay attention to because they're legitimate always, which is not true. Their feelings be acknowledged, but they're not always the best feelings that we have for that situation. But when we fool ourselves into thinking, I feel this way, therefore it's true, I have a right to therefore do, we are truncating the gospel and the biblical narrative in such a way that we're not working for the redemptiveness and for the reconciliation of the world. We aren't through Christ. It just isn't happening. And in fact, you could say it's maybe the opposite of that. But that would be the other thing I'd want to throw out there, which is not something that's we're going to be able to solve very quickly. But I do think that it is part of the problem in our country. That's part of the polarity that we're experiencing. When you think about the polarity that we have, sometimes it can just be simplified in a dangerous kind of way into me versus we.
Right.
And the fact that we don't even see the world in the same way makes it difficult to have conversations sometimes. I've talked to some people. I've got a neighbor down the street who has signs up in the yard that says "Planned-demic."
Yes.
Coronavirus equals common cold.
Mm-hmm.
So he's got signs up about that, and I'm trying to befriend him when I walk by his house by just easing into that relationship a little bit and talking a little bit more, because I'm curious about his life and about his world, because I recognize his world is very different than my world.
Right.
Very different than my world, and so often that makes it impossible for us to talk to each other, and I think we need to talk to each other. So,
amen to that. Absolutely. I look forward to hearing more of that, and as you get to know him, hopefully you will, and hear more of his story and be able to understand him a little bit better too.
Hope so.
And that you will rub off on him a little bit too.
Maybe he will with me. I don't know.
You know what? Again, it's about our community. So when we're on the we, right?
And finding common ground. That's one of the ways we do connect, is when we find common ground with each other, and we can acknowledge that and say that. Say, yeah, this we've never been here before. I talked to a guy yesterday. He happens to be a merchant in town, and we were at some distance, and he was saying, I don't know how long I can do this.
Right.
And he said, we've never been here before. I said, it's a foreign land and we have no map.
Right.
How do we live in this foreign land? Again, look at the Psalms. How do we live in this foreign land, and where do we hang up our lyres and sing a song? And what song are we singing again?
That's right. That's it. So grab your community and let's go. Right.
There you go. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this time. I have thoroughly enjoyed this. And, my prayer is this time for us together will help others feel that sense of community as well, and understand they're not alone. There's a lot going on in our heads that it's going on in all of our heads.
Absolutely.
Great.
Thank you, Debbie.
So thank you very much, Jim. Take care.
God bless.
You too.
Thank you.
Reverend Knoll, Pons Reformed Church, under the leadership of Reverend Nathan Busker, and I hope that you have found this conversation helpful, that you feel more connected and less alone, and more hopeful as we continue to journey through this strange time of the COVID-19 virus. God bless.